So Yamada, back in 1998, published an article to review functions of self-injury. And these are the 6 headings that she came up with. This is essentially a theoretical paper that looks at this issue as we try to seek to understand this behavior more. I have been particularly interested in the area of affect regulation because I think the youth that come to see me who are the highly repetitive self-injurers, many of them are using it as a means of tension release or improving a dysphoric mood or coping with a drop in their mood, etc. But certainly it can be a mix, and certainly it can be more than one behavior. So things like self-punishment or some kind of influence interpersonally or communication interpersonally as a means to manage dissociative feelings, to take the numb feeling away, as a means of excitement or just to see what happens kind of thing, or as a means to set boundaries between themselves and the world around them. This is a newer model that's out. Matthew Nock and his colleagues, including Elizabeth Lloyd Richardson from Harvard, and they did the chapter in our book specifically reviewing functions of self-injury in youth. And they have come up with a very interesting model that looks at 4 factors. And this is a nice model to keep in mind when you are assessing a youth. Understanding that the arrows can be more heavily weighted in more than one direction as well. So basically, the sense is that there are more automatic or more internal issues at hand, or there might be social issues at hand that play a role in the use of this behavior. There also might be things that positively reinforce it or negatively reinforce it. So positive reinforcement might be that it creates some kind of desirable physiological state, like makes them feel better somehow. Negative reinforcement reduces some level of tension that they're experiencing or offers an escape. Positive reinforcement could also mean getting more attention from others, although I shy away from any description of this behavior as attention seeking. I have never really found that description useful. I think that I look more at it as a behavior that provides some kind of social communication. So just to move on, this is actually the first study that we did, and at the time I was working in a partial hospitalization program in Ottawa that was specifically for youth. It was an alternative to being admitted to hospital, so you could gain entry direct through emergency, or it was a step down from the inpatient unit to make their stays as short as possible and to reintegrate them into the community. So we could have these kids 5 days a week during the day, or if they were back at school, we could have them come up to 2 evenings a week and then graduate them out. And it was interesting because we had a lot of these youth, and we'd sit around in our team meetings, and everybody would have an idea of what we thought we should be doing with these youth and what the root of their problem was. And that was when I first went to the literature to see what was out there to help to guide me, and obviously was struck by the fact that there was very little out there. So rule number 1, if you're a clinician researcher, pick an area where there's no research been done, and it's very easy to get published. Okay, so that's basically what we did. We had an elective student from Queen's University who came and stayed with us for 4 months and got questionnaires going with the youth, both on the inpatient unit and the partial hospitalization program. And my original idea was this. I thought, wow, I'm really interested in these kids, and I'm really interested in the kids who do it episodically versus those who do it repetitively. And my initial idea was I'm going to get a sample and I'm going to split it and try to compare these 2 samples. Well, as it turns out, every youth that we sampled pretty much who reported self-harm or self-injury was in the repetitive range at least once a month for the past 6 months. So we basically ended up studying this population alone, and nothing wrong with that, because sometimes it's better to study a homogeneous group to start. So the mean age of this sample that we studied was 15.7. By far the majority were females, and I think that is typically our observation of what comes through both outpatient as well as inpatient services from sort of more acute care are the females, and I think there are reasons why we can discuss later if we have time. What we found was the mean age of onset was around 12.7, and age of onset for males was higher than females. Now, I think that it is important to state that we did have males in this population who were self-harming, self-injuring, because many people at that point in time just believed it to be almost a purely female type of behavior. And that was certainly not the case. So just to review, their global assessment of functioning was very low, 50%, or 50. Their Beck Depression Inventory scores were very high in the severe range. The STAXI is a state trait anger inventory. I was very interested in this concept. Is self-harm something that's done to internalize their expression of anger? And what we found basically, if you look at both internalized anger and externalized anger, they're self-rated as equal. But what they are low on is anger control. We also, on a general questionnaire that we asked about self-harm, noted a significant prevalence of both problems with drugs and alcohol as well as eating disorders. So these behaviors co-occur with other types of self-harm behaviors. The majority thought they had got the idea on their own. It was by far a solitary, not a group activity, but a large number had disclosed to at least one peer or parents. Mind you, these were people already in service, so typically when you're service, these youth have had the opportunity or have been kind of gotten to the point where they've had to disclose. Another interesting association we found was that 100% of these youth said usually or sometimes the event of self-harm was associated with some kind of psychosocial stressor. So we asked in our questionnaire, why do you self-injure? And this was our first questionnaire, which we came out with. We'll be talking about the newer version of it. And the mean number of reasons that youth answered was 8. Now, what I know is when I sit in an interview and try to ask these kids these questions and go over a range of questions, not just their general mental health problems, but ask questions around their self-injury, it's likely that I'm going to forget to ask one or two of these questions. And that's why I sometimes find a self-report questionnaire a more systematic way to go through these series. And it's also my sense sometimes that these kids are more willing to report stuff on a piece of paper when they're not having to discuss face-to-face with another person. So by far in this sample, the main reason was to cope with depression, but also to release unbearable tension, cope with nervousness and fear, frustration, and express anger and revenge. So the top 5 are all basically affect regulation reasons for their self-injury. I just want to bring you down to the second last bullet as a highlight because I was very struck. These youth, almost 50%, were using their self-injury as a means to stop suicidal ideation or attempt. So these kids are in distress. These kids are in some respects using this behavior as a harm reduction method to prevent more serious acts. And that begs the question of suicide, the issue of asking about suicide behavior and ideation at the same time you're assessing for self-injury. I'll talk about that a little more. So in the inpatient sample, prevalence can be as high in some units as 80%, but I'd say we average around 40. And that's not surprising looking at the population that we're treating in that situation. But in high school studies, particularly 2, one done in Montreal by Nancy Heath, my colleague, who co-edited the book with me, and Aviva Leigh Gindu and her supervisor, 2 high schools in Vancouver, the rates were around 14 to 15% lifetime prevalence, which I think is pretty significant. And then in our community-based study, we got 17%. Interestingly enough, Janice Whitlock in the US has done a study of a college student sample, and her rates are 17%. So we know onset is in adolescence, but even looking at a high-functioning college sample of students, rates still, in my opinion, are quite high.